We have seen that ideas spread around the world, they move through time, and they penetrate culture. And I'd like to take a little more time to focus on the concept of ideas penetrating culture, because it is something that the church has lost sight of. I mentioned that ideas usually are spawned in universities or perhaps monasteries, where people spend their lives wrestling with critical questions and issues. And they move from there to the filmmakers and songwriters, the poets, and then from there they have an impact on the professionals. And the professionals then create institutions that surround our lives, the laws, the structures, the institutions that frame the society in which we live. Someone said to me the other day, reflecting on a consumer society, they said, we are being consumed by consumerism. Consumerism is part of our lives. It's part of the structure, part of the fabric of our lives. And we love spending money. But do we realize that what this society is doing is consuming us? It's consuming our hearts, our souls. It's consuming our health. So we live within the framework of these structures and institutions of society, and we don't even know what's happening to us. But I want to take a few minutes and look at the role of the artist, what I call the balladeer. In the medieval times, there were clowns, I think they were called jesters, and then there were balladeers. And the balladeers were people who would sing, they were minstrels, they'd go from town to town telling stories, turning the history into a story to remind people of who they were. And it is that concept of balladeer that I want to speak of today. We have a lot of Christians who love the arts, but very often they are discouraged by the church to engage in the arts. I was talking to a woman not too long ago, and she's a very good painter, and I asked her what she's painting. She said, I haven't painted for 20 years. And I said, well, why have you not painted for 20 years? And she said, because it's not spiritual enough. And my heart was broken for her, but it was also broken for all the people that could have enjoyed the art that her life could have produced. Because she had this faulty idea of what was spiritual and was not spiritual. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of going to a Christian music festival at Estes Park, Colorado. And there were about 400, 450 mostly Christian singers, songwriters, and producers of Christian music, but there were also a few dancers there. And while I was there, I was invited to be part of a panel discussion one afternoon. I was the only one of the 4 panelists who was not a singer, but I felt honored to be in their company, and there was a group of maybe 45, 50 singer-songwriters that had gathered for this afternoon workshop. And one of the singers that was on the panel was mentioning that Madonna was in Japan that week doing concerts, and that people were paying $1,000 a seat to hear Madonna sing. And that was his point, the amount of money that Madonna was making. But when it was my turn to speak, I picked up on the theme of Madonna being in Japan, and I asked this group of singers and songwriters, what is Madonna doing in Japan? And they looked at me with this, that's a stupid question, kind of a look. And after a moment, someone said, she's doing concerts. And I said, yeah, she's doing concerts, but what is she doing in Japan? And somebody else said, she's entertaining the Japanese. And I said, yes, she's entertaining the Japanese. But what is Madonna doing in Japan? And somebody said, she's making a lot of money. And I said, at $1,000 a seat, she's making a lot of money. But what is Madonna doing in Japan? And they had no other answers. And I said, she's discipling a nation. And you should have seen their jaws dropped. They had never had that thought before. And how tragic this is, because our task as a church is to disciple nations. And one of the greatest gifts that can be used for discipling nations is that of the arts. And here were all these Christian singers that didn't even have a clue. Most Christian music artists are busy entertaining the church. And they could be using their gifts to disciple their nations. I was sharing these things at a leadership training in South Africa a number of years ago. It was one of those rich experiences where there were 150 young leaders from 50 different countries. What a privilege it is to be in that kind of an environment of both leaders but also the diversity of backgrounds. And as I got to this point in the session, the people that had invited me to come to South Africa came up to the platform and said, "Darrow, you need to sit down." So I went and sat down, and as soon as I sat down, a young woman stood up, and she had tears running down her cheeks. And she said, "I love to write music. I have a drawer full of music at home, but I never sing it, I never play it, because my pastor said that music is of the devil." She said, "For the first time in my Christian life, I've heard a Christian leader say that perhaps God had gifted me for a purpose, and maybe He wants me to use my gifts to disciple my nation." And she sat down, and a young man stood up. And he said, "I come from a nation that the world considers backwards. And my nation, we treat women very poorly." He said, "When I go home, I want to begin to write ballads about the glorious things in my nation. And I want to begin to write songs about the dignity of women to see if I can change the way women are perceived in my society." And he sat down. And another young leader stood up, and another and another. For 45 minutes this went on. And at the end of 45 minutes, there were no other young people that wanted to stand. And so we brought up, I think there were about 35 young people. We brought them up to the stage. We had everyone else stand. and raise our hands over them and pray for the releasing of their gifts to the arts. It was a remarkable time. The Greek philosopher Plato said, "Give me the songs of the nation, and it matters not who writes its laws." What did Plato understand? Plato understood that music shapes culture, and culture is upstream from economics and politics. Give me the songs of a nation, and it doesn't matter who writes its laws. We're seeing this all over the world today. I don't know how many of you have seen the famous Kiss. A couple of years ago, Madonna and Britney Spears did a concert, a global concert, and at the end of a song, they did a French kiss. Do you think this was planned? It most certainly was. They, as artists, were making a statement to the young people of the world that there's no difference between a man and a woman kissing and two women kissing. They were at that concert discipling nations. And today, what do we see happening all over the world? We see government after government seeking to redefine the laws of marriage, to make marriage between any consenting adults, not just a male and female. And I look, as I travel to South America, as I travel to Africa, these nations in all their poverty, why are their parliaments, why are their congresses spending so much time creating these laws? Because the culture has shifted. And the arts have perpetuated the shift in the culture. I love going to a YWAM base in Puerto Rico. I go there every year, and I love going there for two reasons. One, they understand the importance of worldview and they take it very seriously. And the other, they attract a lot of young people who are artists, poets, songwriters, singers. And a few years ago, I was there teaching, and one of them asked me, they said, "Darryl, we understand you're writing a book on the plight of women." And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, would you give us a session while you're here about the book?" And I said, "Sure." And that night, I taught on the maternal heart of God. And while I was in the middle of teaching this subject, I noticed that the women were beginning to cry. They'd never heard anything like this before, and they'd never heard anything like this from a man before. And after a little bit, the men started crying because they were hearing the broken hearts of their sisters. The leader of the base, the YWAM base, came up and led a 45-minute time of repentance, and it was really an incredible evening. But the next year when I came back for my week of teaching again, one of the first things that happened, I had two poets come up to me at separate times, but each poets, and they wanted to share with me some of the poems they had written during the year about the dignity of women. And then I had another one of the guys come up, and he's a budding young filmmaker, and he said, "Darryl, after you left, we wrote a screenplay on the issue of the dignity of women." And they wrote the screenplay, they acted, produced, and directed this 45-minute movie. They'd never made a movie before in their lives. but they wanted to become balladeers to speak prophetically to their culture. And then after that, another young man came up and he said, "Darrow, since you were here last, we've written an original song album, 11 songs, and the music for 11 songs, all on the dignity of women. And these were not songs for the church. One of the titles of one of the songs was, 'There's no condom for the soul.' You can have a condom for your body, but not for your soul." So these young people took this album and they toured all over Puerto Rico sharing these songs. And then they went to Colombia and toured Colombia sharing these songs. They had captured, their imagination had captured the idea of becoming balladeers for the kingdom of God. We need to encourage young Christian men and women who love the arts and are gifted in the arts to begin to speak prophetically to the culture. And we need to encourage pastors. When the church is healthy, she is the wellspring of the arts for a nation. And right now the church is not very much involved in the arts. Maybe if it's religious art, religious songs, yes, but in terms of shaping the music and the culture, we're not even in the game. So we need to encourage pastors and young Christians to begin to engage in the culture with the arts. I'd like you to talk or to reflect around this idea. I mentioned that culture is upstream from economics and politics. And what does this mean for Christians? And what are the implications of this as you look at your own culture and the political and economic processes that are going on today?